Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is James Mountford, and it's my absolute delight and privilege, really, to be the editor-in-chief of BMJ Leader. I want to welcome you to this BMJ Leader live event. You can see on screen, I think, Rachel Moses from the NHS Leadership Academy and our speaker, Professor Anton Emanuel. Rachel will introduce Anton very shortly, but Anton, it's wonderful to see you here, and I very much enjoyed getting to know you a little bit at UCLH many years ago now when I was at UCL Partners. It's a small world. So this evening's session actually bridges an event back in the winter on the 24th of February. I imagine quite a few people who are in the room here were literally in the room in London back then. And we had a very, very engaging, very vibrant and insightful day where we were focusing on a number of takes on the question of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm delighted that this, together with social justice, and we have a special issue coming out shortly on that for BMJ Leader, that's one of our strategic themes, along with being connected across whole systems and joining up care, digital care, and kindness and human connection. So those are our four overarching themes at BMJ Leader. And before I hand to Rachel, just a very quick word about BMJ Leader. Some of you may not know of it. I hope some of you do. I hope some of you have read some of our content, particularly perhaps our blogs, which are, I would say, pushing the boundaries of debate and trying to hear from as wide a range of voices as possible. I just popped our homepage into the chat, and thank you, Molly, for posting a really excellent blog from last month by a pair of clinician and manager. And it's about trying to bridge this gap that often exists in many health systems between professional managers and clinicians. So the way I'll do this is just to say that we're called BMJ Leader, and we want to be the go-to place for good scholarship and debate on leading in health and care. But each of the letters B, M, and J is really wrong. So why is that? So B stands for British, but we are global. And increasingly, I'm pleased to say that we have team members on our editorial and review team and content and perspectives from much broader than the UK and Europe. M, it stands for medical, and that's wrong because, as I was just saying with regard to managers, we want to stand for good leadership and to be a guide for good leadership, no matter what your background. And Rachel is one of our editor team. She's a physio by background, illustrating how the M only tells part of the story. And then J for journal. So that's wrong really as well, because although the heart of BMJ Leader is a regular peer-reviewed journal, we have a lot more events and content such as tonight. But you'll find Twitter chats, you'll find the blogs, and increasingly we're moving into short videos and other things. So BMJ Leader, read it, contribute to it, and tell us what you think of it. So with that, I want to hand over to my BMJ Leader colleague, Rachel, to introduce Anton. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Anton has to say shortly. Rachel.
Thank you so much, James, for setting the scene and that warm welcome. So I'm delighted to be here tonight as the chair. We will now follow a 50-minute presentation from Professor Anton Emanuel, and that will be followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. Please submit any questions through the Q&A box on the Zoom call. That should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you do want to submit any general comments, please use the chat box for that. We're very open. A reminder, the session will be recorded and you will receive a link to the recording, which will be to view on demand, which will be sent out about 2 weeks from today. So it is my absolute delight to introduce Professor Anton Emmanuel. Now, Anton is an esteemed medical leader. He has a number of roles and is currently working as lead for the Workforce Race Equality Standard for the Welsh Government. But as importantly, Anton is one of the most kindest, compassionate, inclusive leaders we have in our NHS. I am a massive fangirl, he knows that. I'm sure many of you listening will also have the same admiration and respect for Anton as I do. So thank you for all you do, Anton. And we really welcome you to deliver your talk tonight. Over to you, Anton.
Oh my goodness, I feel humbled. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for allowing me to join tonight, especially as I had to cry out at the last minute in February due to close family bereavement, which I had to travel abroad for. So thank you for this opportunity and to present what I think is a slightly didactic talk. I hope it isn't at odds with anyone's perspective, or if it is, I hope it provides a focus for us to discuss that. It's certainly passionately felt, it's certainly informed by the literature, and it's informed by the data that we have. So if somebody can just confirm that the screen is visible, then I'll press on, if that's okay.
Yes, we can see that, Anton.
Thank you. So I've taken a bit of a license with the title, but hopefully it'll explain what's to follow. And say, do please engage. If you're not comfortable doing it in the session, then please, I'm very open about social media and my email address, which are both available on the internet. So just contact me, because I'm urgently in the belief that engagement on this is the most important thing. I think you have to be, if you're serious about inclusion, to be available, and you have to be competent. All the rest of it is optional. So a fundamental part of my thesis around why leadership is the central pivot for all of this is that, unfortunately, discrimination, inequality, whether it's by race, gender, whatever else, is not bad individuals behaving badly. It really is not. That notion, and I think this often leads to people feeling that they using the word racist or racism is like a personal slight. And it's that kind of cliche about some people react as though being called a racist is worse than actually undertaking something racist. The problem isn't individuals, as I keep saying in different ways. The problem is the system. The system is actually working perfectly. The system is doing exactly what it's meant to do, which is to maintain the status quo. It is to maintain the hegemony of straight men like me. So whatever disadvantage I may have by the color of my skin, I have the great advantage of having huge privilege in terms of being a man, having had the benefit of education, having had the benefit of a close family unit as I was growing up, having had the benefit of being straight. These things work to my advantage, but for those of us who are minoritized in multiple ways, this is a huge issue. So fundamentally, leadership is what's going to change this. You're not going to educate people out of a broken system. Okay, you don't train a robot out of bad behavior. You have to do this essentially by breaking it down and building it back up again. And why do I feel this is so critical? I mean, I present to you just, and this is not intended as a joke, this is a quick Google trawl of, which just put in tribunals, NHS, and just screened the recent 2 months. And I won't go through any of these in detail, but I'll just put them up one after the other. And you can see the dates on them, that they all relate to things that have occurred in the last 2 to 3 months. And these are all things which have gone through various forms of tribunal, employment tribunal, or more formally. This is Patricia Miller, whom some of you may know, is the ICB chief in Dorset, the only BME ICB lead in the country. And the list goes on. I mean, this is, I think I stopped at this point at the beginning of this a couple of weeks ago. So we have a problem. We have a problem which I think if we were in the US, we would now have lawyers doing adverts on telly telling us about class actions, about racism in the NHS. This is a significant problem for our NHS. And we are at a tipping point. And we're a tipping point for all sorts of reasons. We're a tipping point because of the choices that have been made for us at national level over a variety of reasons, politically, in all senses. We're a tipping point in the post-COVID space. We're a tipping point in terms of where we are as our national politics and our international politics and as a society as a whole. But in that situation where there is so much turmoil, the idea of steady as we go and it'll sort itself out and there are other priorities right now and Tom, don't push this, just isn't right. It just cannot be sensible to allow 330,000 Black and Asian people in the workforce to go to the wall at a time when they are at their greatest suffering, at a time when all staff, white or BME, are going through the worst times. But there's a disproportionate impact on minoritized people, as we know. So what is the context of talking about this? The context of this is that if you take a kind of very sort of philosophical perspective on this, we want equality in our systems because it's morally right. It's how we want our children to be treated. It's how we want to be treated ourselves. As a kind of moral imperative. There's a legal imperative, and the fact is, as one aspect of the legal part is those tribunals that you've seen. Another aspect is that we are lucky to live in a country which has an Equality Act. The Equality Act of 2010 is actually a very good piece of legislation. But unfortunately, in the NHS, we are in breach of that legislation every day. Not pretty much every day, but every day. So there's a moral reason, there's a legal reason. There is also a business case reason. There's a reason in terms of how we will do better. And I'll just, if I may, present 3 business cases. I know there's a variety of colleagues in the audience. There's some who are leaders. There's some who want to know what they can do to provoke their leadership. One of the arguments I'd make is that we're all leaders in some way, to some extent. As I'm meant to sound patronizing or glib, it's meant to say that when you have a systemic problem, as we accept we do, I hope we accept we do, the solutions have to involve all of us. So in my role when I was previously in NHS England as the lead for the Workforce Race Equality Standard, working with the best people I've ever worked with in my 35 years in healthcare, we undertook some work where we essentially looked at all 225 organizations in England and we ranked them from 0 to 225, or 1 rather, where 1 was the very best organization, just top of the picks, and 225 was the least well performing across all the metrics. And we could look at it in different ways around leadership, around disciplinary, around culture, etc. But anyway, we could also do an overall sort of league table. And what this figure, case study 1, shows on the horizontal axis is the farther to the left you are horizontally, the better an organization you were for res ranking, and the worse you were the further you are to the right. And this is very early on in my time in NHS England when the first vaccine was available. And we looked at vaccine uptake. And what you can see is an inverse relationship between the organizations. Each doctor is a single organization, which, in other words, if you did your EDI, your equality and inclusion work properly, your staff, not just your BME staff, but all your staff were inclined to take up this new therapy. And that's an important thing about the impact of actions on a culture of an organization, which I'll return to in a while. Case study 2, is one which looks, instead of staff outcomes, looks at patient outcomes, which is the most important part of what we do. This is the CQC ratings of maternity units, rated in the usual 4-point scale from inadequate through to outstanding. It's a bell-shaped curve, so most organizations are in the middle, requires improvement or good. And what you see again is those res rankings for these organizations, where the average res ranking for the outstanding organizations is 23, and sort of 6-fold worse for the ones which were inadequate. So these workforce outcomes have a correlation on with mother and neonate outcomes, and this is another aspect of how equality matters. We're going through an odd, in mild language, time with the idea that equality and inclusion is apparently everyone's business, and that therefore we don't need posts which have quality and inclusion as a central part of that. When I was in NHS England, we did a survey of all the jobs, all the 1.3 million substantive jobs in NHS, and looked for how many people had titles with that in the various trusts around the country. We identified at that time just under 450 of these, which represents a tiny fraction, as you can see in red, the bottom right, of the overall workforce. The other thing our analysis showed is that if you look at how these numbers increased year on year with each row, you'll see that the things that increased were actually indicators 1, 3, and 9. And what were those? Those were indicators about how we make small advances in progress in representation and recruitment of staff and their promotion. 3, the likelihood of formal disciplinary, and 9, board membership. In other words, the metrics, which were very much about process, were influenced by having process people in your organization. You needed a resource to be able to deliver on equality and inclusion. It doesn't happen because it's everyone's business. Those organizations which don't have an EDI person are the ones which languished, especially in the disciplinary and board membership spaces. So having this posts, having this focus is utterly important in my view. And I've sort of made that point in a very simplistic slide version. I did a bit of homework in preparation for today to talk to a couple of colleagues about what they would like us to include. And some were unfamiliar with the idea of the Workforce Race Equality Standard. For those of you who are, you can gloss over the next 30 seconds. But essentially it dates back to when Simon Stevens joined the NHS. And he came from the States, and he made this observation that as he went around hospitals around the country, there are lots of Black and Asian people serving him in the canteen, seeing patients in the wards when he went around. But when he went to the executive and the boards, he didn't see any. And based on that, he organized essentially an academic collaboration with some experts from around the world, including Roger Klein and others from the UK, to produce the idea of some indicators which would reflect truly meaningful measures by which we could assess how we were doing, to take our temperature. This was introduced in 2014, and a year later was put into the NHS contract as a mandated requirement. And if we look at the last report I was involved with, the one from earlier on this year, and we try and map the history of the 9 indicators and what they've shown over the years, this is where I would say leadership of a certain type has taken us, because these actions we have to recognize are the consequence of the leadership we have in government and in our own organizations. So what's got better if you look at the arrows on the far right? Well, we've got more BME people in the NHS, but almost all of that is related to, almost all of that is related to international recruitment, nurses, medical graduates, AHPs. We're bringing staff into primary care as well, social care as well. It's very clear we're bringing big numbers in. So we've gone from about 17% of our workforce 7 years ago, being from a BME background, to almost a quarter now. In fact, it's about a quarter now in England. Green arrow for very senior manager representation, but it's still only 10%. It's less than half of the overall representation. So the pipeline is arrested. And we've had nurses and doctors in the NHS from this foundation in 48. Remember the Windrush anniversary a week ago is only 2 weeks before the 75th anniversary of the same year of NHS Foundation. We've had BME people in the NHS for forever, as long as it's been NHS. The very bottom, the BME board membership, also that's increased, but that's only still 13%. It's still only half of the workforce representation. And the other thing about disciplinary, I'll talk about in a second, the green arrow going downwards, that's a good thing. I'll talk about that in some detail. Everything else has not really changed, So we can't take a huge amount of pride, because in some ways, the number of BME people is something which is a policy about bringing people in. But it would appear that we bring them in and then we treat them unfairly. We don't appoint them equally. We expose them to greater levels of discrimination, harassment, and bullying. So this is not a comfortable position for us to find ourselves in. And I think we have to then think about what it is that is causing this. It isn't, as I say, racism isn't bad people doing bad things. And it's not like stroking a cat and making choices to be racist or discriminate based on gender or sexual orientation. People make choices because the system that they serve allows them to default to doing that. So what can we learn and what can we do better if we're taking this forward? Well, what needs to be done, I think you can put into 6 areas, which touch upon leadership. And the bulk of what I'm going to talk about essentially is around those 6 areas. And then, if, again, by request, I will present about 5-10 minutes, if I may, on what I think actually being an ally as a leader is at the end. So I think we need to use smarter indicators and aggregate some things to make them make sense. I think we should set an ambition that we do this not just in hospital trusts. 90% of our healthcare occurs in primary care with GPs. So much of the crisis we face at the moment is due to the poverty of our social care system. And for patients, they move or should move seamlessly between these sectors when they are unwell. So the notion that we can just focus on our secondary care workforce and say that's the way it is, if that's how bad it is for yourselves, and imagine the privileged position we're felt to have, whether we do or don't, does it even matter, or we're felt to have in the system, you can imagine how much more pressure there is on colleagues who are inverted commas further down the pecking order, close inverted commas. We need to, those of you who have heard me talk before know how obsessed I am about breaking data down and then reaccumulating it, to package it in ways that you can make decisions with. And that decision making essentially is how we then, when we break the data down, how you then reaccumulate it to understand where the focus of action should be. A big part of this is then to use the RES to understand what is best practice. And the RES in itself is no more than a data tool, and it is not going to bring about race equality on its own, but it is absolutely pivotal to being able to deliver race equality. With the RES data and with an inclusive-minded leader who's prepared to take action, then you have a situation where you can then bring about change. And the final thing is around having the desire to do this from our national position. So I think I made this point about having to work across primary social care and secondary care enough times to be boring now, but I think it's critical that actually we expand the remit of the RES work to include this, whilst also breaking it down to understand the particular challenges faced. So you'll know that we produced a medical RES, the inaugural medical RES last year, and there's another one due out this year, to illustrate the particular challenges faced by doctors. We've started disaggregating the data for midwives specifically, more which are non, for nurses more generally, for pharmacists, for being some of the disciplinary work on AHPs. We've begun to disaggregate data. We should be expanding this. We're looking particularly closely, hopefully many of you will know, on the bank staff, but we need to be looking at this across the force. There's actually need for multiple forms of RES work, because this is a societal problem. Just looking at it in one sector is not going to get it done. The data also needs to speak to our staff experience. The case on the left is one of many made the social media, which is why I've produced it. When I was in the RES, I kept a running log from my first day through to my last of reports I had. I wonder if you can imagine how many in my 2.25 years in NHS England, I committed 422 reports of individual experiences like this. While I've been saying that, you can read this as well. This is a email inappropriately and inconveniently for the sender, done as a reply all rather than forwarding to a friend, about an application with regard to an applicant who was British Nigerian heritage staff member, and you can read what that implicit little remark and the little X at the end tells you about the sender and presumably the intended recipient. That is frankly shit leadership, forgive me. That's the kind of thing which data needs to be able to reflect that. That shouldn't be one person suffering. That should be something which the data can reflect. So disaggregation of data, you maybe have seen me present this data, and the first thing to recognize is that white people are not all the same, BME people are not all the same. And once we started disaggregating the data, we began to see the very obvious truth, which all minority people would have told you. The white community is not remotely homogenous. The experience of white Europeans, white Irish colleagues, Gypsy and Roma people in particular, is so much worse than the standardized norm for white British colleagues. In general, in these displays, you'll see that blue relates to the white population and orangey yellow colors for the BME population, and darker bars reflect women, paler bars men. And what you see is that the experience of Black and Asian people isn't the same. That for other Black, which usually means second generation Black people, is twice as bad as for Chinese or Indian people. And you can see that generally, apart from the Gypsy and Roma community, everything is worse if you're a woman than if you're a man. So we need to disaggregate by gender, by ethnicity, specific ethnicity, and by part of the workforce. If you look at this again, this is for we've just historically previously presented the res data just as all staff, but if we start breaking it down, this is indicator, which one is this, 6? So this is one about experiencing discrimination from your peers. What you see is that actually, if you go from that left-hand panel for all staff, you actually look at the detail, you break that down. For general management, i.e. managerial and clerical staff, second from the right of the panel, almost to the extreme right, you see that actually the experience is worse for women. And if you're a BME man, you don't have it quite as bad. So the whole point about this is that to understand that the true meaning of intersectionality is to understand the additional weight that being minoritized gives you, not to say that all characteristics are the same. And we can disaggregate further in order to really understand the particular challenges. We're interested in the experience of African doctors, African male doctors in particular, in response to some queries that came into us, and identify that there was a particular disadvantage experienced by those colleagues in particular sectors. So there is a real issue around how we deal with race and how we can look at data to help us understand the challenges. But once you understand things, what are you going to do about it? So in response to Simon Stevens' challenge of saying I want 19% of all our representative senior groups to represent population, i.e. 19% in the workforce as it was then. When I started in 2020, late 2020, we set ourselves a target to say, okay, what will that look like? What will the dotted line look like from there to 2025? You can see that up to that point, we had a pretty much flat line on VSM's ethnic minority background. It had bumbled around 6% for a while. I'm not saying we've cracked anything, don't get me wrong, please. But by setting KPIs and aligning that to the inclusive recruitment program that Prerna is marched with, we were able to see in the last couple of years a significant change beyond just the increasing numbers of international medical graduates and nurses coming to the country. Those VSMs take years to culture, so it isn't just the increased numbers we've had recently, it's actually about changes in culture in organizations where that can happen. Data. So we can use data for KPIs, we can use data to change our policies if we're a leader. So let me just illustrate this from this set of panel. Very busy slide, apologize, I'll bring it in gradually. So this is looking at midwives, so we can break our data down to look specifically at just the midwife population out of our 1.3 million, just take our midwives. And we can see in this display, in each row, it's a banding, an AFC banding, and the columns go as white and BME overall. And then the next 3 columns are the BME population broken down, as we've said, into 3 manageable groups, Asian, Black, and other. So that's those 3 groups add up to the BME group. So that's the overall picture we have for midwives. We were doing a large project with colleagues in the Midlands around their recruitment. And so this is data for one of those 7 regions in the Midlands. Pretty similar to what you see in the national picture. But the critical part, again, the same display, the same 5 columns, the same rows. Critical displays this 3rd panel from the same data set there, which is like an observed minus expected figure. Observed is what we currently have. Expected is what it would be like if you had true equality, if you had an even distribution of BME staff across all the bands. This is what you would need to do. So in other words, when you are doing your recruitment rounds, you need to be employing 16 midwives of band 6 and above in this region, 10 BME, etc. And of those, there should be 13 from a Black minority background, 6 from Asian, etc., etc. So that you can organize to take positive action to make sure that you get the terms of the Equality Act, which encourages and it requires you to take positive action. That's not positive discrimination, that's illegal. Positive action is what this is about, and using data to inform that. So the data is the key for all of this stuff. Data is also critical to help organizational leads know what to do. So we report to the organizations the detail of how they are faring. So in this situation, each row is one of our various indicators broken down to more than just the 9, as you'll see. And then the columns are what's interesting. This is the highest ranking This is trust number one in terms of res data in this country. Names are redacted. You can see it's the Northwest, and you can see it's a mental health trust. So this is the trust data in that first column, RAG rated automatically. This is how it compares with the region, the Northwest. This is how it compares with other mental health trusts like itself. This is how it compares to the national picture in the next column. And then the final column is a RAG rating. You can see there's lots of green there. This is literally the neighbouring trust, which is 4.5 miles down the road. And you can see that it's not meant to be the worst trust in the world. It isn't. It's about 80th. It's in the top third. But you can see that what we can do is, if you are serious about this as a leader in this organization, you understand what your challenges are. You understand where you need help from. This is another way we would like to display our data, and we're going to in Wales. Each dot represents one organization. You know, I'm very keen on data displays and analysis. And this is for one of our indicators. It doesn't really matter which. In ideal, this is indicator 8, in fact, sorry, I should say, it should be fair to you. This is the one which says, have you experienced discrimination or from a manager? In an ideal world, all our dots would be clustered around that bottom left, the 0, mark, so that ideally no one would experience discrimination. But the reality is that some people do, in which case you then have this kind of funnel of acceptability, that kind of sideways V, which is where there'd be equipoise, equal numbers of people feeling discriminated against by whether they were white or BME. And what you see, unfortunately, is that almost all our trusts, bar 3 or 4, are left of that. So the question that really comes is, from that display, it's not meant to be shock horror. I've redacted the various names, as you'll see. But what can that organization, which is a real outlier and has been for year upon year upon year, what can that organization learn from this one? There must be some wisdom. As a national team, surely that must be our function, to share that intelligence, not to shame anyone, but to say, look, how can we help for this indicator to help that organization do better? As it happens, these two organizations are almost identical, but one is doing something very right, and another one is doing something which is really troubling its staff. And there should be something we can do. And that should surely be something which, again, the data informs us what we should be doing. And leadership is about having the information you need. I said earlier on, you need the resources, and part of the resource that is the stuff you create, but also stuff that you get given. This is an example of leadership in action in a really useful way. And I hope I'm just sort of seeding ideas of things that some of you may want to take away. This is the data on disciplinary disparity. In other words, the likelihood of Black and Asian nurses, doctors, AHPs, pharmacists being referred to their regulator. And you can see that one of the impressive successes of that was in the early years, things got very much better. But we've sort of hit a brick wall in the last few years, where that ratio, we're still about 1.25 times more likely as a country. What that actually means, more importantly than 1.25, is actually the fact that 50% of our organizations, still 49% to be fair, have a significant greater likelihood of our Black and Asian colleagues being referred to formal disciplinary process. 50% of our organizations. That just isn't good. So what do we do with that information? When we started this project, it was a time when East of England, one of the 7 regions, was developing its own anti-racist strategy, and we worked very closely with the EDI leads and the regional lead in East of England to implement 3 actions, which there's an evidence base for. So evidence works. The evidence was you could do one of 3 things if you wanted to improve referrals for. Actually, most of the data comes from the army and court martial, interestingly. But public sector and private sector, there's lessons to learn from all of them across the world. So the first thing to do was to establish independent panels where the case was reviewed for the responsible officer to get information with the case anonymized by gender and ethnicity, and the RO then got an opinion. They were independent to make their choice, but they got an independent opinion of experts, some lay, some legal, some workforce directors, and if it is a GP case, some information from GPs, a midwife case, etc., some as a virtual panel. Then using the National Patient Safety Agency decision tree tool to understand mitigations of why something may have occurred and go through a tick box exercise, which you go to the next box if you cleared it. And that resulted in a lot of people, as it were, combing through the case to understand mitigations and not put them through disciplinary, but deal with it in a much more proactive, less traumatizing way at local level. And the third one, and it's actually incredibly important as it transpired from our data, was the post-action audit. In other words, when an organization gets a referral back with no action taken, what does it learn from that? We had at one extreme, one of these organizations, which in the preceding 3 years had referred 18, 26, and 21 colleagues in those 3 years to the regulators. Of those 64, I think it was, referrals, 63 were BME colleagues in a trust which was only about 25% BME, and all but 2 of them had been rejected, or sent back, shall we say. And of those 2, 1 was the white colleague and 1 was the BME colleague. So there was such a disproportionality what was happening, but no action seemed to be taken. And what could we learn from the post-action audit to do all that? And what I'm going to show you is the same data as you've seen on the left-hand panel, but broken down by regions for that last year. And what you see is in the East of England, where this occurred, there was a significant drop. So we went from 31 out of 33 organizations having a significant disciplinary disparity to just 3. So this is possible. Okay, it's possible to do good work. And in some ways, our data is so eye-watering that actually any change is going to be dramatic. So we worked to create a compendium of best practice. I went through great detail about the what works for disciplinary, but when I had a bit less facial hair, I worked with NHS providers to summarize the literature. There's a huge literature in the publications of what works in recruitment, in promotion, in talent management. What does positive action look like? We produced with providers this website, which essentially each of those little boxes on the right is a click you can open up into the list of actions that are known to be effective. So the idea was that you could then have an idea of what to do with your data. You'd get your data disaggregated and reaggregated back for your organization to see where the problems were, and you then know what to do with that. Because one of the things that I fundamentally believe in terms of leadership actions is that this notion that you can change culture, it's one of my least favorite things to listen to, because I sort of believe this figure in a very true way. It's an ancient figure I had when I was doing some work in UCL and when I was where my chair is, and trying to explain to people, saying that actually we should focus on the culture of academic, and saying, no, change your processes, please change your processes, because actually that's how we change things. If I see people being promoted fairly, if I see people not being disciplined inappropriately, if I see bad behavior towards somebody based on being minoritized, being called out, I begin to like and believe the culture of that organization. I belong there. And that is what changes culture. It grows from the barrel of that organically formed disruption of processes. It doesn't grow from doing a Black History Month event once a year. It doesn't grow from saying something nice once a year on Disability Network Week. It doesn't do that. You do stuff by actually changing the processes, disrupting the machine that's generating bad outcomes for your people. That's how you do stuff. And the role of leadership is that pivotal point to encourage everything above that. That kind of dark orange layer in this figure is there to support all the HR challenges which are required above that. And leadership should be invisible, should be below the level. It shouldn't be somebody grandstanding about how marvelous they are. And the greatest leaders you've all worked with are exactly that. And they bear the weight of organizational change and then are stirring below them to change that culture in an organic way. That is what good stuff is about, in my view. So ultimately, all of this comes to that best of all A words, which is about taking accountability for this. And how do you use your position and your authority to make your data something which you're accountable for to your board. And that requires a certain amount of freedom from the people you report to. We're all managers in some way. And it also needs us to be humble about the things we don't understand, and recognizing the good fortune we've had to be where we are. Put upon as we may feel, we are all in some ways advantaged compared to people around us. So if you allow me to then spend 5 minutes talking about, because this is the thing I was asked for most online to talk to in this session, what does being an inclusive ally look like? And tell me something practical, don't tell me nonsense, unquote, was what a friend who is a leader in in a London trust asked me. So I think you have to begin to understand how much by understanding your privilege. These are the things that have been gifted you by virtue of your place in society, or your biology, or your good fortune, that you have been born with that unearned advantage that allows you to look at the same goal as the person beside you, but not to recognize that they have different things to get through to get to that same goal. So there's a really important point about that, that you have to recognize that. And by understanding that, it means that we can take away this silly argument that, oh, there's lots of disadvantaged young white men from the coast and so on. And of course there are. And I rail about their suffering as much as I rail about anyone else's. But that recognizes there's a privilege that comes from our being not in a deprived situation, or having had grown up in safe family environments, having gone to schools where learning was prioritized, having gone through the processes which allowed us to get our advantage. That is all a privilege, not the one that we should resent or hide away from or pretend we don't have, the one which we should embrace. And not even as simple as wishing for other people, but just recognizing that that privilege that you have had is something that you have to explain about why you are where you are. Okay, if you can do something about making somebody else have those privileges, great. But at the very least, recognize that you have them and that you didn't necessarily earn them. They were your great good fortune that you had. Because if you don't do that and you just say, oh, well, hey, Anton, you've got to a good place, you risk tokenism. I've shown a silly illustration from what it looks like in Hollywood for women, but the whole point is you don't want, no BME person wants to feel they're part of a quota or a token. It puts unfair advantage on them, unfair pressure on them, and it doesn't in any way progress the organization's equality. Another risk of not doing this, or not being an ally, is this idea about taking assimilation. I say this as somebody who grew up in French West Africa, where I was born. I was born in Nigeria, but when the Biafran War broke out, we went to French West Africa. And the French culture, when it came to Europe, was very much around assimilation, that you're French if you understand the core value of the revolution and the Republic and the Marseillaise. And this idea of assimilation, that we shouldn't have mosques and we should all assimilate. And actually there's a danger in that because we have to understand that people have a social identity. It doesn't have to define who you are, but your identity is a critical part, especially if you're minoritized and you're exposed yourself to an environment where you're not feeling safe in your work or your society. Your identity amongst your kin group is incredibly important. And assimilation as a way of saying, well, you're over here, you better belong and like it and get on with it, and is not the right way to create equality. Assimilation is not equality. If people choose to assimilate, great, well and good. If they choose to retain their social identity, a decent society respects and encourages and makes sure that it thrives, because social identities are dynamic, they're not static. The children of second generation immigrants, etc., feel very differently to their parents. We all have multiple identities. We are very rarely just one-dimensional, if ever. We all have these privileges from our background. And this point about salience for me is incredibly important, that there are certain things which I advantage. My being a man, a cis man, gives me the biggest advantages in life of anything else that I'm experienced. So there's a prioritization of characteristics. A leader facilitates networks. These are my African forefathers, Nyerere and Kenyatta, Selassie, Nkrumah. These are the people who formed a Pan-African Congress, a group of leaders from spoke different languages, different parts of the continent, yet they formed an alliance, a network, and that was facilitated by each other. But as a leader, making sure your networks are not just tokens of, yes, we have a network for this and that and the other, but actually making sure that there's an aspect of their being fostered, that they have actual agency, that they have voice, that they have something protected. Just £2,000 in the budget, maybe a year, may be enough to allow them to hold an event which has a huge impact around inclusion, around induction of new staff or whatever. Creating those networks is unbelievably important. And the strength of Pan-Africanism, which is ultimately broke by corporate mindedness, actually came from that idea of networks being something which is powerful, which is why 15 countries were able to force an empire to close at a time it was looking to close. So networks are critically important. And being an ally is something that one does consciously. So once you recognize you have this unearned privilege, you then have to think about what you do in a conscious way. Dare I say it, in a woke way. That's what consciousness means. It means you're awake to the things around you. Allyship is not just standing up and grandstanding when things are easy. It isn't saying empty nonsense when it's easy to say something on, Chinese New Year or Black History Month or whatever. It's actually doing things quietly and all the time. Allyship isn't just saying, as medical director or as this or the other, I'm doing this. And remember in allyship to be humble, that you'll blunder. I have blundered so many times around aspects of inclusion. I hate being considered somebody who knows a lot of stuff around this. I've read a bit and I've had a chance to talk to colleagues whom I respect hugely, but we always blunder, and a willingness to accept that blunder is unbelievably important, as important as being humble about our privilege. You have to be humble to know that you're going to get it wrong, and quickly fess up, and do that with alacrity and with willingness, not do it again. So what are the bits around allyship? You've got to be prepared to sort of say, follows on from that, is just to listen to what people say, foster those networks, and listen to them, listen to what they're saying. Don't just think, oh, well, I'll sit in the corner and I'll check my emails while they're chatting, if I attend at all. Your task isn't to say, I've formulated that group, tick, good for me. Your task is to do that and to attend occasionally, please. And when you're there, to be participant. That doesn't mean speaking all the time. It means listening, but being there, being in the moment of those things is unbelievably important. I can't say that enough. The leaders who've done exemplary work on this are the ones who really put a big commitment into that part of allyship. I start each of these with a kind of a quote. They're all from quotes from events that we organised when I was I still work organising now in the Welsh Government. It's what I learned from. In other words, acknowledge the person whose experience you're giving, because you may be able to use your position to flex that, but you need to know where you've come from. You need to pivot that from somewhere. And a similar version of that is when people have the opportunity for a stretch appointment, make sure that you give that fairly. It isn't just come to the person who you've known best or who you've seen the most or whatever else. Make sure you've gone through a process of thinking, is it fair? If it's somebody else doing it, who reports to you, check that they've done that as well. And make sure that that people who have influence in your system know about your minoritized staff. It isn't just about knowing about your friendship group. It's a really important thing that we've got to reflect our widest community, not just our immediate group that we find it easiest to get on with. We all find people easy to get on with more than others, but that's fine. It's absolutely fine to like and find certain people easier than others. That's normal, but that can't influence how we behave. And if you find that it is, then you're normal. But if you find that it is, and you're checking yourself, that's being a superstar. Checking that it's not just favouring people who you think are a good fit, because that's your opinion about what a good fit is. Then there's something around, making sure that you put people, give people the prominence they deserve. So when we have events that we're organising, panels that we're speaking on, are they all men? Are they all people who look like us? Make sure that they are representative of the workforce at least, or ideally who you want to be talking to. Make sure that you take people who are minoritized and make them part of your own network. It doesn't mean you favour them. And if people say, oh, why you do so-and-so for so-and-so, you explain that this is part of what being a leader looks like. And make sure that if you're an academic type person, make sure you have the widest collaboration group possible, not just for your EDI papers, but for everything. Be more than that. Actually try and champion things as part of the job. If somebody asks you something because you're the loudest voice in the room, say, how about checking in with, people have subject matter expertise, the people who you depend on in writing a paper or in producing a slide or whatever else. Give them a credit, let them know that they've been asked and used, or their information has been valuable for the minister or anyone else, and make sure that we are genuinely advocating for colleagues who are otherwise hidden. So please do that. That segues into then how you sort of use colleagues to boost each other. make sure that you give absolute credit for everyone who's done any work in there, acknowledging their contribution that they've made in all the facets, so that you can say, look, so and so help with this, so and so help with that. You're not weighing up one against the other, but you're making it very clear that you're not just giving a list of names. If any of you saw that fantastic Lizzo acceptance speech where she called people up from minoritized background with a detail completely memorized of what they had done. That's true allyship. That's really speaking volumes. None of us can do that well, but we can aspire to that and know that's what we should be doing. Be close to people. There's again a temptation to think, well, I'm a lofty person in my leadership position, I can't be getting my hands too dirty. People will expect that. You don't have to. Again, making clear what the boundaries of your allyship are. I'm listening to you as this role. I can't take this on, but I really want to hear what you've got to say, and it stays completely within you and I. Now go ahead, tell me. That's the stuff you do. You're not saying, I'm going to sort this out for you, don't you worry, God, so-and-so's a swine, I'll sort that out. Nothing in that. You're just there to give that person the sense that I have been heard. Okay? I mean, you've seen the terrible stuff that's come out from the Stephen Lawrence. 30 years on, we are still hearing things about the incompetence of our police force. And, if you read what Doreen Lawrence has to say, you'll see that it is that thing that not being listened to that is the biggest trigger for this. And that is just the most prominent thing I can think of today. But this happens all the time. You don't have to take somebody's problems on, but you can do the favor of listening to them and explaining at your position at the start so that they don't expect anything inappropriate. Once you've heard something, don't betray the person's confidence, but speak to it. Don't really give any of that information away, but use that knowledge you now have to speak up. If you witness something, speak up. Organizations which do EDI best are the ones which have an app where a member of staff who sees something instantly records it, and it pings into central office 4,000 miles away, a different country, and they say, oh, something's happening in Oregon. We've had 2 reports today from the shop floor there. That kind of stuff. So we haven't got that in NHS, but make sure that you act when you see something, and act in response to having heard something. If something's going off message, cut in early. Don't wait for it to develop into a bad situation. If it was never going to, it's better to cry wolf than to create the trauma that happens from a minoritized person being discriminated against. A lot of what I was saying is about minoritized people, not necessarily about race, but this is about an inclusion and leadership thing. The data is strongest, in my experience, is strongest with race, but what's true from the data is that almost all this applies to all of these things. I'm almost done, you'll be glad to hear. How do we measure benefit from all these things? Well, we can measure benefit from the impact of our work. And this is just the kind of illustrating that in terms of our workforce. So we can look at workforce outcomes, some of which will improve, hopefully, and more will improve as we take on leadership in a more sincere way. We've got to be smart, though, and ICBs allow us to think about how equality affects outcomes. I showed you some of the data for maternity, other data we showed you on mental health data that we also got about sectioning and inappropriate sectioning, but we can begin to triangulate the data from workforce outcomes, the population census data, and then population health outcomes. That's how we will then really be turbocharging equality. That's certainly what we're doing in Wales with the Anti-Racist Welsh Action Plan, where because we've had a culture of having health boards for a lot longer, we have basically ICBs, which are kind of a readaptation of a health board in Wales and in Scotland. You have that system of integrated working across social care, primary care, secondary care, and you can begin to triangulate how the data in our organizations matches up with the health outcomes and the deprivation index indices for our population. We can really begin, that's another way of looking at benefit. Another aspect of benefit is the moment, and forgive me for using a slightly off-message slide. This is a slide which illustrates the world men's record for the 1 mile. And what you see is that it's improved over time. Yeah, it's not surprising from 1860 through to now. But in all those little bars representing the time, the one that's most significant in history is that one. It's the one in 1954, when there's a fractional benefit from Gunnar Haag's 1945 record of 4 minutes, just under 1 second. But dipping under 4 minutes was a gigantic thing. There was a moment when that meant and mattered to somebody. The actual magnitude of difference was tiny. You can see we've got much bigger decrements in recent time. Okay, but of all the MAR records, one that most people remember is Bannister. May not even remember Isham El Garouge's current record holder from 1999, but we'll all remember that because there's a moment, and measuring benefit is about seizing a moment. So as well as looking at our staff outcomes, as well as looking at our patient outcomes, we have to recognize that there is something about doing something at the time we can. We've slightly blown it with COVID. You know, what COVID revealed was the deprivation that people suffer affects their outcomes. We've slightly blown it with Black Lives Matter from the race perspective, where again, we had a bit of wind in our sails. But when the next impact of austerity comes, we need to be ready to seize this. And as leaders, that's the other part of this. And the reason I show this is about scanning the horizon and knowing where we've come from to know all of this. This figure is lifted from the Lancet. I'm sorry to mention them in a BMJ session, but this has made a point which I think is quite interesting and important, which is that to change stuff, you have to fit your actions into a pathway. This notion that you can just do unconscious bias training as a drop-in parachuting somebody in or reverse mentoring in isolation, that doesn't work. There's a circle and a circuit of inequity that affects people from birth through to death. And we have to interfere with the pathways along the way, recognizing that as that pathway is going along, there are various aspects of workforce, community, and individual life which we can target. And as a leader, your responsibility is to sort of stand above this, to float above the globe, seeing that picture of the processes and seeing the difference between an action at individual, at organizational, and at sort of national level, and how that looks. So ultimately, what do I believe? I believe you have to be accountable. Everything about data is to be accountable. This is my Welsh slide, where you create heat maps of what's happening in different parts of Wales. You then ally that to a what work session, create more data accountability, create more heat maps, and just keep doing this again and again and again, and grind this out until we have got something which looks like equality. Recognizing that this is the penultimate slide, that there are actions that we take around our individual humility, about understanding what privilege we have and where we come from, understanding that we need to take action which is below the surface, but which is incredibly robust below the surface, that we need to support the teams and be explicit about that. I haven't mentioned freedom to speak up. I have very strong views around how that slightly fails our people at this time. I'm happy to explore that in questions, and then to use evidence-based interventions to make things better. Essentially, my life hero is James Baldwin, so he's always pleased to end up with him as my last slide, which makes this unbelievably important point that literally this is another way of saying that data isn't everything, but without that data, we literally have nothing. So we have to start off by understanding what our workforce metrics look like and use that as a leader to then face down the problems we have. Because if we don't do that, we're both betraying the trust of people who've submitted that data, but we're also betraying our chance to actually make a change at a moment when there's a chance to make a change. So listen, thank you very much indeed. Sorry to have gone on a bit, and please, I invite disagreement or challenge for all this, because I think that's how we learn. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Anton. That was incredible, and you are bang on time. You were 1 minute early, so thank you so much. And you've just so eloquently described the problem, the impact of the problem at individual level, at organizational level, at system level, of course, at the patient end as well. You've provided us with the evidence, examples of good practice, and also the call for a movement of change. And I think that's what you were describing, like a social movement. How can we come together at the end to create that change without wanting to use the word cultural change? How do we actually create safe and equitable systems for all? Now, we do have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to remind people to please put your questions in the Q&A box. But if I start with the data, you mentioned how important it is to get the data, because this is what we need for the evidence. We have enough evidence. We know the evidence is there, but like you said, how do we know we're measuring change? How do we know the impact of what we're doing? But we know the most disadvantaged people in our NHS, and this can this is the same across the world, are the people who don't have trust in the system and the surveys, and they're the most least likely to fill them in, but the people we need to hear from the most. So I know there's lots of managers on the phone and lots of clinical managers, operational managers. What advice do you have to people, particularly if they know they have poor response rates, so they can really encourage people to fill in the surveys?
This is an important point, and there's that kind of weight we have of not wanting to further abuse people's trust by taking their data and not acting on it. I think the first thing we have to do is move away from big organizational presentations of here's all the successes we've made. We're the 4th best in London. We're actually the 30th worst in the country, but we're better than others. That kind of stuff. Show people that you are honest about stuff. There's an amazing organization, some of you may on the call may work in it, which every year puts its res data up on the riser of the steps up to the staff canteen. So it has a 10-step thing, and 9 of those steps have their indicator 1 to 9 data, which just shows here we are on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side shows where we were last year. So they can see they're not a particularly outstanding organization, but there's an absolute commitment to transparency about it, and there is a change over the last 4 years towards it. So number one, when you do these things, show the staff that you are honest about it. Don't just pretend, put a glossy face and, you know, we're the 14th best in this and whatever else. Just don't give me that nonsense. And or find a little bit of, or amongst our physios, we found that they were really happy. Ignore the fact they're radiotherapists and everyone else was desperately unhappy. Just present stuff honestly, warts and all. This is not a competition. Number two, show that you use that data to do something. Not that, oh, we're listening, we're reflecting, we're going to engage our process, we're going to challenge our pathway. No, don't do that. Just say, listen, you know, we picked this up. So what we're going to do is invest this in your staff network, or we're going to actually change the process whereby, or when you make a process to HR changes for promotion or talent pipeline management, tell people you've done that to get engagement. Because people, if you look at the whole lot of data about why people fill questionnaires in, either personal gain, which is obviously not something that NHS can do, or gain for those around you. If you feel that people are going to benefit from this, white and BB colleagues will contribute in large measure. One of the really interesting things is, sorry, this is a very long answer to a very simple question. Look at organizations which we know the ethnicity makeup of each organization based on its ESR data. We can then look at how that compares with the staff survey data from each organization. And what's absolutely fascinating is that the organizations which do res well have the highest level. They get about 65% of staff engagement with the questionnaire, of which disproportionately more comes from the white colleagues. So this is not about getting only people from a minoritized background to fill in their thing. It's about creating that cultural bit by your actions. So your culture should be the actions you take, as I keep saying. So that's how you encourage that. And then there's some basic things, you know, get your leaders, not just your BME leaders, but your white leaders as well, to do sessions, to remind staff about the thing, to do stuff online, little social media clips, and make sure that people of all backgrounds are shown making that pitch for the survey. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the impact of those little pulses, when you do a pulse survey of pulses information, the social media click in a place will give you about a 15% bump in your completion rate of questionnaires. Sorry, I had too much data, but I'm sure you're using it.
No, that's really helpful. And I know there's been a couple of comments about accountability. And on one of your slides, you did mention, in terms of the good practice, the accountability being at national level and regional level. There's also accountability at individual level and organizational level for some of this. So the first bit is on the accountability. Obviously, the corporate response would be that it's everyone's responsibility, but then it becomes nobody's responsibility. We know that. This is why we need dedicated EDI teams at national, regional, system, organizational level until we get this right. The accountability bit, but then also the consequences. So when we have people accountable, what are the consequences of not understanding the problem. So that is in the number of staff participating in surveys, but then also improving, holding our hands up and saying, you know, we're really bad at this, but we're going to make a managed approach to improve, like you said. So what needs to change so that the accountability is there and then people are responsible for the change?
So I think there's a need for a national organization to work with trusts to make their action plans and set KPIs. The idea that you can just give people information and that they will change it and then things will get better, that's been disproven by 7 years of the RES, unfortunately. Just presenting data and asking people to get on with it doesn't result in change. What you have to do is marry up the knowledge of what works. So we can have those resources like the provider's website and so on. We can have all those, but you still need to tailor it and help individuals know what the KPI is and what timeline it is. So some things like the disciplinary stuff, that change within a year. Some stuff like talent management will take a long time for you to see your changes. So what KPIs do you use? What time course do you, so you don't get any unintended consequences of tokenism or just parachute somebody into a couple of Band-Aid C positions? Phew, that's done. That doesn't do anything. So how do you generate that? So we can't expect organizations with busy clinicians to suddenly take on a role as an EDI lead and know all the answers. It's unfair on that person. He's usually low banded and doing the best they can to have all the answers. So we need to share the data and then it needs to be owned. So for me, it's about the national taking responsibility. Accountability doesn't just mean sacking some poor devil at the trust. It means us working jointly to know what that is. Setting a jointly agreed KPI, setting a timeline to that, having a person's name attached to it. It's dead easy. And I know, again, back to Doreen Lawrence, she says, you know, why is no one in the Met being sacked? What happened to my son? I don't want people sacked, but what I do want is that there's a named person who's responsibility for that, because what will happen is when there's a person who's responsible for that, they will make gigantic strides to make sure that the data improves. Hopefully not in an illicit way by doctoring it, but by doing it straight. But that is what authoritative leadership looks like. So I think the leadership has to come from the national body to help with that and to set KPIs. And James, when he was worked in one time in NHS England with the kind of special measures team, or whatever the euphemism is now. And I think there is a way of working around that without having to be a stick wielder to actually use data in a way which results in change without beating people or sacking them.
No, I totally agree. And you've answered another one of the questions in a roundabout way, that is it the responsibility of senior leaders within an organisation? And I think what you've talked about is senior leaders setting the scene, creating the narrative, providing the evidence for change, that movement, living by their values and behaviours. This is why we need diversity in the top roles. Not just for role modeling, because of lived experience, because of diversity of thought, because of the unique qualities that people will bring into that space. But often the perpetrators of the discrimination are the middle managers. Often they're the ones that have modelled the behaviours of those above them to get into those positions, whether it be racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. We know that there's a real problem at that level. And this is when the discrimination continues to perpetuate, because there's no one holding those people to account. So in terms of speaking about, allyship and change, what do you think needs to maybe happen at that level? Because inclusion is intentional, but inclusive leadership journeys aren't.
Mm.
And you can get into positions of middle management without ever having to go on an inclusive leadership journey, especially if you're white, heteronormative, cisgendered, you don't have a disability or neurodiversity. So where's the change needed there?
No, you're absolutely right. So for me, I fundamentally believe in the principle. This is an odd answer, but not a practice. The principle of appraisal. I genuinely believe that appraisal is potentially the route to do so much good. As it is, I can speak from experience of being a medic and experience from close friends who are AHPs and pharmacists and so on. It ends up being the most tick boxy of exercises, the greatest nuisance and challenge. There isn't absolutely zero value to anyone. No, that's a lie. There's very little value to the majority of people going through an appraisal. Yet again, if you look at organizations which have done this stuff well, not in healthcare, appraisal is the tool whereby your personal development includes being a leader. The nature of getting older is that you take on, or you acquire positions of responsibility if you stay in a system, especially as static as NHS. So the notion that you can just passively, osmotically become a leader is just kind of the myth of medical practice that you sort of watch, see one, do one, whatever it is nonsense. That just isn't how leadership works. So I think everyone in organizations, and again, coming to Wales, we are setting a standard whereby everyone's appraisal has to have a leadership metric in there, or whatever level you're at. Okay, a band 3 person has to have something around that, which isn't about going to a King's Fund course or going to a lecture on this or that. It's about taking a development in your leadership journey, whatever that is, to and from. And that has to be one of your 3 things for the year ahead for all clinical all clinical clinicians. We're working on what that looks like non-clinicians at the moment, but that's a different story. So I think appraisal is, so I've said a lot about it, that's one answer to how to do this. I think the other thing about this is that it's to make sure that this is part of that figure I showed of the globe. This is about recognizing that this is you're trying to change a pathway. You're not trying to just acquire a sudden individual skill. And this notion that you do this, and that's why appraisal for me works, because it's that cumulative, slowly winding your way up to the top of the pyramid. The idea is that you recognize that this is something which is a bigger, so that your leadership progression is part of the bigger organization progression. And again, you can look at gigantic organizations like Walmart, as I always quote. They have got a really mature EDI system, which works through having everyone from the person who serves you in DC airport through to the chief exec having some processes around inclusion. So I think this is possible, but you have to inculcate this into your system and be prepared to spend a huge part of your appraisal doing this.
Thank you. And that segues really nicely onto the undergraduate education space, because we often wait to talk about inclusive leadership development when people are in more senior roles. But actually, if I had a golden wand, it would be that we embedded inclusive leadership development in every health and care undergraduate degree program in England. I'm England centric, but maybe across the world. We're a long way off that, but where do you think the role is? And the question was specifically around anti-racist education in medical schools, but it could be any health and care program, and of course management programs as well. Is there a role?
No, so I mean, inevitably, I think it'd be weird. We know that in the wake of BLM, there's quite a few publications which came out around colleagues, students suddenly being able to voice the things they had about people wanting to touch their hair or being called certain things or whatever else, all that. So, and the idea that our students live in a kind of bubble of academic purity and they're not exposed to the misery of discrimination, that's plainly not true. So there's a kind of imperative to make these poor 18-year-old colleagues isolated from home, etc., have a sense of what they're going through is not unique. It isn't just them being particularly obnoxious. It's actually a thing that is a unfortunately cultural thing, because most, especially medical students, I can speak from personal experience, we come from very privileged backgrounds. Most of my peers, come from and so the idea that you are suddenly exposed to this stuff, so there's a need to help and protect those colleagues there. They're certainly going to be exposed to this as they grow older. We're not going to become anti-racist overnight. So I think there is an option for doing that. And again, sorry to keep quoting other countries, but if we look at the experience from Canada, where they've got a really mature undergraduate education. It's a national program where every private and state teaching hospital and medical school has this modular course, which they have to include, and some choose to do more, notably in British Columbia, which is kind of world famous, has this modular course which looks around things, right? The pastoral bits of it, the process bits of it, the staying out of trouble bits of it, and the personal bit, the allyship part of it. They have this model, and yeah, so there's definitely a part to play to protect these colleagues and to prepare them for the future.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of comments in the chat box, but also a specific question on belonging. And I know this sometimes causes a little bit of debate, you know, in terms of who decides if someone belongs. Is belonging the end goal? What does that mean for people? Does that mean that we can't have difference? So there was a specific questions about measuring belonging. How do we measure that? And yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so belonging is a really complex thing, isn't it? It reflects something about your mood. You know that. We know it reflects something at the time you fill the questionnaire out. People's sense of belonging has been shown to track very, very sharply to their mood, more than so there's much greater changes than you expect week by week from an organization. It relates to, there's a big part which is agency. Do you have the ability to change the culture in your part of the organization? And does your voice get heard? The two complementary parts of the agency thing. Do you have agency to change, and do you have a voice which is heard? Those two things are a really big part of this. You can try and measure it in a single question of what sense of belonging do you have in your organization? That's the kind of standard way of doing it with a Likert scale or a 0 to 10 slider. The other kind of thing we have in healthcare, of course, is that would you want to be treated here? Would you want your relative to be treated in your hospital? Which is quite a composite mix, because it's a mix of both. Is the clinical care adequate, but also is it? Do you feel that people get fair chance to express themselves? And you can then, what the really clever things do then is then say, right, here's your sense, your mark for belonging. Here's your mark for clinical care. Therefore, the difference, and then there's quite a lot of educationalist data looking at that difference between the outcome versus the belonging. So you can say, right, that's the benefit, that's the added value this organization gives. It's crap at clinical care, but it's fantastic at making you belong to that. The gap is widest. And then sometimes you can do it as a percentage to make the high-performing clinical organizations not seem so skewed. So there's lots of ways that you can compute this, but belonging, I think, has multiple components around all of that. And the other question of what influences it, what influences that is that, again, there's correlation and causation, I accept all that, but the relationship between, if you look at the res data and belonging question from the pulse surveys, it's a straight line. It's a P of less than 0.001. So there's a strong relationship between equality.
Now, Anton, we've got about 5 minutes left in the Q&A, and there's some really great questions that maybe aren't short answers, but there was a lot of comments. You talked a lot about networks. I think we all know the power of networks, but we haven't got it right with networks. Cultural taxation is a real thing. You know, people from minority groups being expected to lead those networks with no remuneration, but there is a significant personal price that people pay to chair those networks. You know, from a personal perspective, reliving trauma. I don't think we've got it right, and I don't think organizations appreciate that. So we know the power of networks, we know why they're needed, but maybe at an organizational level, you know, how can we support the networks, and how we can use the data with the networks to create the change, but not expect them to do all of the labor.
So Rachel, I mean, the amazing thing is that if I ask you to guess how many of our 225 organizations have a network, you'll all say all 225 a race equality network. You'd be spot on. All of them do, of which 204, I think, came up in the last 3 years. But that's fine. They've all come up. We had, I think there was 28 or something beforehand, and 197 have come up in the last 3 years. Fine. How many of them receive any kind of financial input to their work from the board? 3. Three in the whole country. How many of them have time protected to present to the board? 17. How many of them are expected to write their trust action plans? About 200. So, as you say, the simplest thing to do is to give a certain amount of money and board time to create, for number one, to create a sense of fostering sense of that network being valued, belonging, etc., etc. So there's that part of it. Number two, the part about giving that access to. So it's something like, when you write the action plan, you will have an executive or somebody from the team to sit with you and go through it, or to understand that. That is unbelievably important. So it isn't just so and so wrote that, that's now a trust action plan. No credit given to that person, no responsibility. That action plan means nothing. So I think supporting our networks, we created, when I was in the EDI team in England, this maturity framework of what they should look like in terms of how they start and what they should be at. So 3 tiers of maturity. Ultimately, everyone trying to get into the top tier. The amount of resource that requires is peanuts. 2,000 quid is peanuts. A session of executive time once every 6 months is very doable. Yet, yeah, ultimately, I blame our executives for the failure of our networks, very frankly.
I don't disagree with that comment at all. So there's a couple, I'm going to merge a couple of questions about positive action. Now, I am a fan of positive action in the fact that I do think it's part of meaningful change. It's part of a much wider process in systemic change. But there's been a big push towards diversity on recruitment panels, which I think, quite frankly, is often tokenistic. I don't think that's a positive action movement. So why do you think trusts are taking a move maybe to more positive action strategies? But how can we ensure they're not tokenistic?
So again, not wanting to self-promote, but I mean, the definitive work on this, of course, is Roger Klein's and Alprecht's summary of no more tick boxes. But the kind of bastardized version that we produce for interest providers is a simple action list of what works in terms of what positive action really looks like when a chair of a committee can stop a process because it's not fair. As you say, it isn't just about sprinkling a totaling number of women and BME people into a panel. That doesn't work. It's about the fundamental things about how we advertise, how we shortlist, what we do with the groups who are those colleagues who don't get appointed, what do we do with them. Every decent organization puts them into a kind of hothouse to then develop their talent and share it out. We're the biggest employer in Europe. We should be able to hothouse those colleagues who we've been shortlisted. That's positive action to say, hey, you didn't make it on the following grounds. Not that there was somebody better on the day, that nonsense. And what we're going to do, we're going to keep you in this place. We think you should look at development on here. Part of the positive action is that your appraiser will then say, for the next time around, you get something in this space where you lacked. And you're then kept in a space, and then when an option comes for a stretch opportunity or promotion in their area, that's what they do in gigantic corporate. That's what happens at McDonald's, at Starbucks, at Google. That's what they do. People would do this if they felt they were in the system. So yeah, positive action, which is not tokenistic, is incredibly effective. The problem is that, and again, I'm trying to badmouth NHS England, but we've put a lot of things which are ineffective under the label of this is a positive action you can take, and it isn't. Again, high impact actions and all this. It's all euphemisms. There are genuine positive actions which are effective, and there's ones which are not effective. Roger's masterwork explains all that. We've tried to trace that in the provider's link.
And that I'm in agreement, and it actually becomes dangerous, doesn't it, when you use tokenism as a recruitment strategy to entice people into an organisation that isn't fit for purpose, that is racist, that is ableist, and then you don't have the support in place, so people go on to experience horrendous discrimination. So it becomes a danger. And the final question I will read out, Anton, but this does link in. So racism and racial discrimination harms and even kills. Do you think racial discrimination incidents should be part of the risk management strategy for all organisations? I think that's a really important point.
I have zero doubt that's essential. And that includes racism from patients and carers. it isn't exclusively from staff and each other. So again, we're moving in Wales to try to create this as part of our as part of a datexable type thing. So that's I think suddenly will start paying notice to that kind of stuff. If it's coming on their radar all the time, it goes from being, oh yeah, there's some nonsense. They actually start paying notice for this because it becomes part of patient safety. Because you can't argue that discrimination is harmful to patient safety. It's absolutely well recognized. I mean, literally I could do another 50 minutes of evidence proposing that. But I think we have to move towards that notion that, the problem with the annual survey is exactly that people, it's retrospective. And so people don't record things, they don't remember things, they don't bother reporting it. If we had something just a live system which says, here's what happened, and the closest we have at the moment is this reporting system. But until we have an NHS employer app, that's what we have to do. So no, I strongly believe that there is every case to be made for this being something which is a live recording, which requires a M&M type meeting, where we go through and say, right, why is this happening in theatre? Why it's wrong with the culture of our radiology department that this keeps occurring, or whatever else.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this then goes back to your point about the importance of this data being gathered at, individual team level, organizational level, system level, national level, like throughout every level, so you can identify problems, trends, improvements. It's the only way we're going to really galvanize for meaningful change.
I see Devinder's point in the chat about subtle discrimination not being evidenceable, and I absolutely take that. And so I think there's and again, if you look at zero tolerance, if I can lean into that space, there's different forms of things where people want to level say, I only want to have a white person treating me, through to more subtle things. Now, what that requires, it requires the onus to be on the organization to respond, so that all the employee has to do is to say, I witnessed this or I experienced this, and that's that ball rolling. Now, you'll say, oh, well, that'll lead to, and all the managers I say this to say, oh, God, that'll be a nightmare, and you have no idea. That'll lead to a cascade of incidents. I'll have nothing else to do with my time than deal with these. Absolute bullshit. Forgive me for swearing twice in this session. Absolute nonsense. There is zero evidence that's the case. The idea that minoritized people are waiting to be disruptive and tell lies is actually infamous and offensive. So there's, again, lots of literature about the tiers of discrimination as experienced in the most subtle forms of othering. And, and there needs to be a process, which the process doesn't have to be result in massive complaint. It needs to hear your complaint, I acknowledge that, we'll put a little flag up, and if that happens again with this person, when that place, we'll look into it. Oh, this is the second time it's happened, so we're now going to do something. There's a pathway, people feel that it's been done. So I can't give short answers for you, Rachel.
Absolutely. Oh goodness, I could start another conversation with you all over just about that last statement you made, but thank you so much, Professor Anton Emmanuel. What an incredible session. We are truly thankful for you for taking the time to sit with us tonight. We really appreciate it. We will answer some of the other questions in the chat box, just so you know, and to signpost you to some of the papers that were mentioned. But it is time to close the session. I have 1 minute. Just on behalf of BMJ and BMJ Leader, thank you everyone for joining us tonight and participating in which was a really active discussion and session. Now, I do believe Molly has been posting the feedback forms in the chat box, so please help us to put on more of these sessions, to put on even better sessions. I don't know how we can top tonight, but please fill in the feedback forms. A reminder, you'll get an email with a link in where you can view this recording in a couple of weeks' time. And finally, we are delighted to announce the second BMJ Leader Live event on the 10th of November this year. It's going to be in Birmingham, so please save the date, more details to follow. Thank you so much, Anton, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. All the best.